Ladies and gentlemen, this is a response to the video, America's Mortgage Crisis in a Nutshell. I was going to try to get this all in one part, but I have too much information that I'm going to have to cut it off when I get to the part where his cut and paste statistics about food prices. We'll put that in the second part, but I figured this user would say something about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but apparently this has escaped him. We'll have a video sometime in the near future exposing government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie and Freddie as the real culprits in our economic downturn and preceding housing market crash. Let's get down to brass tacks, shall we? At the 14-second mark, we have a graph of crude oil prices in $2006, but the source isn't given. I'll make sure I reference which of my articles the rebuttal is coming from. This is from my Big Oil article. Alan Reynolds says this shortly before he references the price of crude oil rising from $12.01 in a barrel in February 1999 to $34.40 in November 2000. I wonder if this user was caterwauling about a near tripling of oil prices in the last days of the Clinton administration. Here's what Reynolds says. In 1983, the economist James Hamilton shocked the profession by showing that all but one of the U.S. recessions since World War II have been preceded, typically with a lag of around 3/4 of a year, by a dramatic increase in the price of crude petroleum. Professor Hamilton's thesis was challenged in 1997 by Ben Bernanke, Mark Gertler, and Mark Watson. It is difficult to isolate the effect of oil prices on recessions, they argued, because a number of the most significant tightenings of U.S. monetary policy have followed on the heels of major increases in the price of imported oil. They found that an important part of the effect of oil price shocks on the economy results not from the change in oil prices per se, but from the resulting tightening of monetary policy. The Fed funds rate was deliberately pushed above the 10-year bond yield in 1969, 73 through 74, 79 through 81, 1989, and 2000. It was no coincidence that the U.S. economy was always in a recession a year later in 1970, 74 and 75, 80 through 82, 1990, and 2001. I'd argue that 2001 wasn't a recession. We didn't have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, but Clinton's next to last quarter, as well as the first quarter of 2001, featured negative growth. Monetary policy at the Federal Reserve has a lot to do with this. The creator of this sham video never covers it. We don't see this user complaining now that oil prices have crashed, which is not a good thing. I'm not arguing for higher oil prices, but when prices crash, it's not a good thing. Then this user says, let's say you make $3,000 a month and your mortgage is $1,000 a month. I don't know anyone whose mortgage is as high as 1/3 of their income. I don't think that's really a good idea in the first place. Perhaps you should get a smaller house. It also depends on the terms of your loan. Did you have a low introductory rate, only to watch it balloon over the next 6 years? Is it a fixed rate? How much can it go up when it readjusts? Are you making principal payments? All these things are the responsibility of the borrower. Then he says, and you spend $1,200 a month on gas and food. This leaves you $800 of disposable income. But he totally forgot about things like garbage service, property taxes, and a landline or cell phone service. What about car insurance? I think he just hastily put together some examples without putting much thought into it, but I digress. He seems to be beating the drum that gas prices are really high, and nobody likes high gas prices, but forgets a whole bunch of useful information to go along with it. He never considers these things. Number 1, higher demand for oil because of modernization in India and China. Number 2, we haven't built an oil refinery here for over 30 years. Number 3, imports have continued to increase. In fact, according to the Congressional Research Service, the windfall profits tax reduced domestic oil production from between 3 and 6% and increased oil imports from between 8 and 16%. This made the U.S. more dependent upon imported oil. Among the worst anti-energy policies we have experienced was President Carter's 1980 windfall profits taxes on oil companies, which reduced domestic oil production and increased imports. Remember how high gas prices were in 1981 in the wake of this? We have this as well. From 1990 to 2000, U.S. crude oil demand rapidly accelerated by 7.41 quadrillion BTUs according to Department of Energy data. And our rate of foreign oil dependency dramatically increased while our domestic oil production steadily declined. Under the 8 Clinton years alone, U.S. oil production declined 1,349,000 barrels per day, or 19%, while our foreign imports increased 3,574,000 barrels per day, or 45%. During this time, President Clinton vetoed ANWR drilling bills that would have clearly made Alaska our #1 state in the production of our own vitally needed oil supply, not only for all Americans, but also for national defense emergencies. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reported the following data regarding U.S. crude oil production and imports in 2006. U.S. crude oil production registered 5.1 million barrels per day. U.S. imports came in at 10.1 million barrels of crude per day. The top countries from which the U.S. imported crude oil were: number 1, Canada, 1.8 million barrels per day. Number 2, Mexico, 1.6 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia, 1.4 million barrels per day. Venezuela was number 4, 1.1 million barrels per day, and Nigeria came in 5th at 1 million barrels per day. Middle East nations that are part of OPEC: Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates accounted for 2.2 million barrels of crude oil imports, or 21% of all U.S. imported crude oil. Iraq and Kuwait covered 34% of those imports. Therefore, 79% of U.S. crude oil imports in 2006 came from nations that were not Middle East OPEC members. We saw this reach critical mass in 2008 as oil prices skyrocketed. Number 4, Katrina reduced domestic oil production for some time, causing oil prices to spike. Number 5, higher gas prices is a worldwide phenomenon. Apparently this user doesn't know this. Robert Bryce covered some important information in an article he wrote at Slate. No, I don't agree with the statement that $4 a gallon gas is cheap, but consider this. Gasoline is also a fairly minor expense when you consider the overall cost of car ownership. In 1975, gasoline made up 33.4% of the total cost of owning and operating a car. By 2006, according to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, gasoline costs had declined to just 17.1% of the total cost of car ownership. Of course, fuel costs have risen by about $1 a gallon since 2006. But even with those increases, fuel continues to be a relatively small part of the cost of car ownership. By contrast, the fixed costs of ownership, insurance, licensing, taxes, and financing have increased nearly 5-fold since 1975. When measured on an inflation-adjusted basis, the current price of gasoline is only slightly higher than it was in 1922. According to the Energy Information Administration, in 1922, gasoline cost the current day equivalent of $3.11. Today, according to the EIA, gasoline is selling for about $3.77 per gallon, only about 20% more than 86 years ago. American gasoline is also dirt cheap compared with gas in other countries. British motorists are currently paying about $8.38 per gallon. Norway, they're a major oil exporter, they're paying $8.73. In 2007, out of the 32 industrialized countries surveyed by the International Energy Agency, only one, Mexico, had cheaper gasoline than the U.S. Last year, drivers in Turkey were paying 3 times as much for their gasoline as Americans were. The IEA data also show that drivers in India have been paying more for their diesel fuel and gasoline than their American counterparts, despite having a much lower GDP per capita. It's sad this user never considered this information and instead relies on short sound bites and very undetailed research. Let us not forget, while this guy's whining about the high price of gas, it was people like John Dingell and James Oberstar, Democrats, that wanted to raise the fuel tax, gasoline tax, 50 cents. Then at 1 minute 3, this user puts up a graph that he doesn't reference. It's obviously not adjusted for inflation, because if it was, it would have spiked in 1981, specifically March of 1981, pertaining to gas prices. Then at 1:34, we do get a graph that is referenced and is adjusted for inflation. If you look carefully, you can see how prices spiked in the early 80s right after Carter's windfall profits tax. At 1:40, we're shown another graph, and it's not adjusted for inflation. I'll continue the rest of it in part 2. I didn't get all I wanted done in this part, but we'll continue the rest in part number 2.